start by saying I'm trained as a geophysicist, not a political scientist or a lawyer, but I'm going to pretend to be a political scientist today. And I'm not going to get too much into the details of the SOPA legislation and its implications for the internet, although I've spent a lot of time on that over the last 6 months, both in my work with the Internet Society and with the IEEE. Instead, I'm going to speculate a little bit on what this latest episode means in terms of the political process going forward. So I am going to try to pretend to be a political scientist. I work with some political scientists at Georgetown, where I'm an adjunct professor of Internet Studies in the Communications, Culture, and Technology program. We have a number of students who are doing master's theses on issues related to this. How is the Internet changing politics? But the reason I'm here, I think, is because prior to joining IBM and working in the private sector, I spent 10 years in government. So I worked with Senator Gore back when he was chairman of the Science Subcommittee.
Back when he was inventing the internet.
On my tombstone, it will say, "Here lies Mike Nelson. He helped Al Gore not invent the internet." As a point of interest, tomorrow we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of the legislation he wrote that helped accelerate the growth of the backbone of the internet. And it's going to be webcast. It's an all-day conference at the museum, and it's a celebration of NITRD, N-I-T-R-D, which is the group that Bill set up to help coordinate work. It should be a fascinating conference. I don't know if they'll address the question that you just raised. I also worked at the White House with Gore for about 4 years. And the first thing I learned when I came to Washington after MIT was that there are two types of power in Washington. There's the power to stop something, and there's the power to get something done. And there's a lot more people who have the first type of power. And what we saw with this SOPA debate was a lot of grassroots organizations that came together to use the first type of power. They stopped the process. The question for me is, how can these grassroots efforts get the second type of power, which is a lot harder to get? How can they actually help push things forward? And what's starting to happen, I think, is my thesis today, is that we're starting to see online mechanisms that will allow the grassroots community, the netizens, to push things forward that they want, rather than just trying to stop things and put in roadblocks. The other thing I learned in Washington, the very first week I was on the job, is that it's essential that you always have a good bumper sticker. And the corollary is never get on the wrong side of a bad bumper sticker. And I think the content industry certainly did on this one. The grassroots community was mobilized because they heard that SOPA meant that someone's going to censor the internet here and abroad. They heard that this was going to break the internet. And that was certainly the message the technical community got because of the provisions to change the domain name system. And then the last thing that really pushed a lot of hot buttons was this bill is going to require the ISPs to look at every packet I send. And so it raised all sorts of privacy implications and the like. And when you're on the wrong side of 3 powerful bumper stickers, 3 emotional bumper stickers, it's pretty tough to win. The other problem, of course, was the legislation was vague. I don't think the problem was the due process provisions. It was what's technically feasible, what sites are targeted. Will a site that has 1 million users, 10 of whom are doing something illegal, be closed down? All these were unanswered questions that the supporters of the bill didn't really focus on. And so this did allow a lot of people, not just coordinated efforts, but a lot of individual users to become part of the debate. This has been framed as a Silicon Valley versus Hollywood debate, but the really important player that got involved in this last few months was the user community, the citizens of the internet, as you said. So the question for the future is how will this change the process? I think the big thing that will change, as you pointed out, is the process is going to have to change. The other bumper sticker that really mobilized people was this SOPA bill was drafted in secret. There wasn't consultation with the technical community. And the technical community couldn't find anybody who had been part of the discussions about domain name provisions, for instance. So that was I think that will change. I think the other thing that's going to change is that the grassroots efforts are going to get away from the kind of bazooka approach. When I was on the Hill, the thing we always dreaded was the postcard campaigns. somebody would write an article in the Sierra Club or Ducks Unlimited or someplace and say, send this postcard in. And suddenly we'd have 5,000 postcards that we had to send a reply to. And all it said was just stop this bill, or just one or two sentences. It didn't impress anybody, really, because people had just not thought about the issue, just sent it in. So what's different, I think, is that we are going to see a lot more concerted efforts to give constructive feedback and to actually explain why people are upset. I worry that we are going to see more attacks like Anonymous, the distributed denial of service attack, and that's not helpful either. But what I think is exciting is the more targeted approach. One thing that we're seeing is that the grassroots are realizing that it's about policy and politics. And they're starting to target the election campaigns of specific members. This is really interesting. So Paul Ryan, who hadn't really taken a concrete position on SOPA, suddenly found that his opponent was getting a bunch of money from the net citizens. The person who's running against Lamar Smith in the Republican primary is a hardcore, Ron Paul-loving, Tea Party, gun-toting sheriff who's now getting all this money from all around the country, mostly in $15 and $50 increments. But that wakes up a member pretty quickly. If suddenly a person who's nowhere, totally unknown, starts getting hundreds of contributions because of a position on a particular bill. And the last thing I wanted to point to is that I think things like the Madison Project, which Darrell Issa has created to allow anybody anywhere to make comments on the Open Act, which has been introduced as an alternative to SOPA and HIPAA, is another way in which the grassroots are starting to get specific. They're starting to target and really complain at a granular level rather than just saying, oh, stop SOPA. And that might provide them with some of the power to push things forward. Of the 100 comments already on the Open Act, about six have already been vetted and discussed and incorporated into a new draft. And this could be very positive. It could change the dynamic. There's a lot of people very upset about the process right now. We've got Larry Lessig's new book called Republic Lost. There's a similar book called Greedy Bastards. Jack Abramoff is now crusading against corruption. And so the stage is set. And if somebody was able to take some of these issues and wrap it into an effective political campaign, they'd get 10% of the vote pretty quickly. Ron Paul is getting support partly because of these issues, the secretive process by which lobbyists get things done in Washington. Americans Elect is another place where we might see these issues getting a lot more discussion. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Americans Elect is an effort well-funded, $20 million, to put a third-party candidate on the ballot in every state. And they're using the net to decide who the candidates will be and what their positions will be. They're aiming for the raging moderates in the middle who are fed up with the system, the radical centrists. And I think they're going to be a player in this debate. They might actually, through the use of the net, show how participatory democracy can move to the next level, and also highlight some of the defects in the system that we saw so amply displayed in the whole HIPAA and SOPA process.